Hello, and welcome back to Accreditation Unlocked. I'm Dr. Ken Clough from the Accreditation Collaborative. And today we're opening Season 3 by talking about accreditation in a way that's both familiar and, I think, a little uncomfortable in the best possible way. Because this episode isn't about standards, it's not about timelines, it's not about documentation, it's about leadership. Over the course of my career, I've worked with institutions that had strong leadership teams, capable faculty and staff, prior accreditation success, and every intention of doing things right. And yet, their accreditation experiences looked very different. Some felt steady, almost routine. Others felt tense, rushed, and exhausting. Some led to meaningful improvement. Others felt like survival exercises. What I've learned, slowly, and sometimes the hard way, is that accreditation outcomes are rarely about effort or intelligence. They're about how leaders approach the work. Not consciously, not strategically, but habitually. Leadership style shapes how accreditation is understood, prioritized, organized, and sustained. And most leaders don't switch leadership styles when accreditation comes along. They bring their default way of leading with them. And that is what we're going to explore today. Why leadership style matters in accreditation. Before I walk through the 4 leadership approaches, let me name something important. This episode is not about good leaders and bad leaders. Every leadership approach we're going to talk about today is legitimate. Each one has strengths. Each one can produce success, and each one, when used alone, creates predictable problems. What experience has taught me is this. Accreditation struggles don't usually happen because leaders choose the wrong approach. They happen because leaders rely on one approach for too long. So, let's talk about what these approaches are. Linear leadership. Accreditation as a task to complete. Let's start with what I'll call linear leadership. Linear leadership is focused on order, sequence, and completion. It values clarity, it values process, and it values knowing what comes next. Linear leaders ask questions like, what are the requirements? What's the timeline? Who's responsible for this? And what needs to be submitted and when. When linear leaders encounter accreditation, they often see it as a task to be completed, and there's a lot to admire about that. Linear leadership is incredibly effective at launching a self-study, creating timelines, assigning roles, ensuring deadlines are met, and producing clean, organized documentation. In institutions that lack structure, linear leadership can feel like a relief. Suddenly, there's order, there's predictability, and there's a sense that someone is steering the ship. Early in leadership careers, many of us lean heavily on this approach. Expectations are clearer. Authority is more positional. Success is measured by execution. And here's the important part. Linear leadership can absolutely get an institution through an accreditation visit. But here's the limitation. When accreditation is treated primarily as a sequence of tasks, it becomes episodic. It lives on calendars and in binders. It turns on and off. And over time, institutions begin to confuse completion with capacity. They can finish a self-study, but they're not necessarily building readiness. They can submit reports, but they're not always learning from them. Linear leadership asks, did we do it? Accreditation also needs leaders to ask, what did we learn and what changed? Without the second question, accreditation becomes something you finish, not something you sustain. Adaptive leadership. Accreditation as a problem to solve. Now let's talk about adaptive leadership. Adaptive leadership is responsive. It's flexible. It's situational. It's very good at handling complexity and uncertainty. Adaptive leaders ask questions like, what's changing? What's not working? Where do we need to adjust? And how do we respond to this feedback? When adaptive leaders approach accreditation, they tend to see it as a problem to solve. This approach shines during times of disruption, like leadership challenges, enrollment declines, budget stress, regulatory change, and unexpected findings or monitoring reports. Adaptive leaders are good at mobilizing people quickly. They're comfortable revising plans midstream. They don't freeze when conditions shift. Many institutions survive difficult accreditation moments because of adaptive leadership. But survival has a cost. When adaptive leadership becomes a dominant and permanent mode, accreditation starts to feel reactive. Institutions move from issue to issue. They fix what's broken. They respond to what reviewers flag. They adjust structures under pressure. And slowly, a pattern emerges. Accreditation only gets attention when something is wrong. This is where scramble culture is born, not because leaders don't care, but because the institution learns to wait for urgency before acting. Adaptive leadership helps institutions cope with accreditation, but without structure, it can keep them from becoming stable. The institution becomes very good at fixing problems and not very good at preventing them. Interpretive leadership, accreditation as meaning-making. The third approach is interpretive leadership. Interpretive leadership is reflective. It's sense-making oriented. It's deeply attentive to culture, values, and context. Interpretive leaders ask questions like, what does this say about who we are? Why do we do the things this way? How do people experience this process? Or, what stories are we telling, both internally and externally? When interpretive leaders approach accreditation, they see it as a mirror. Accreditation becomes a way to examine institutional identity, alignment between mission and practice, faculty and staff experience, or cultural assumptions that shape behavior. This approach has tremendous strengths. Interpretive leadership reduces fear around accreditation, encourages dialogue instead of defensiveness, builds shared understanding, and helps people see accreditation as developmental rather than punitive. Institutions led this way often have strong narratives. Faculty engagement is higher, conversations feel more honest. But here's the limitation. Interpretive leadership can sometimes slow action. Reflection becomes prolonged. Discussion replaces decision. Insight doesn't always translate into systems. Accreditation requires meaning, but it also requires movement. Interpretive leadership helps institutions understand accreditation deeply. Without complementary approaches, it may struggle to operationalize that understanding. Expressive leadership, accreditation as a statement of values. The fourth approach is expressive leadership. Expressive leadership is vision-driven and values-centered. It focuses on identity, purpose, and aspiration. Expressive leaders ask questions like, what do we stand for? What kind of institution are we trying to be? How do others see us? Or how do we tell our story? When expressive leaders approach accreditation, they often see it as a statement. Accreditation becomes a way to articulate values, reinforce mission, build pride and morale, and signal legitimacy and credibility. This can be incredibly powerful. Expressive leadership gives accreditation meaning. It connects compliance to purpose. It helps people see why the work matters. But here's the risk. When expressive leadership isn't grounded in structure, vision can outpace capacity. Institutions talk beautifully about quality, but struggle to demonstrate it. Mission language becomes aspirational rather than evidentiary. Systems lag behind stories. Accreditation just doesn't ask who you want to be. It asks how your systems actually function. Meaning inspires effort, but it doesn't replace infrastructure. Why no single approach is enough. Here's the central tension. Every leadership approach we've discussed contributes something essential to accreditation. Linear leadership brings order. Adaptive leadership brings responsiveness. Interpretive leadership brings understanding. And expressive leadership brings meaning. And every one of them, used alone, creates vulnerability. Linear without interpretation leads to compliance fatigue. Adaptive without structure leads to perpetual scramble. Interpretive without action leads to reflection without change. And expressive without systems leads to inspiration without evidence. The institutions that struggle most with accreditation aren't led by the wrong type of leader. They are led by leaders who rely on one style regardless of context. What experience teaches about leadership? One of the themes I explored in my recent essay, What I Learned About Leadership Throughout My Career, is that leadership maturity isn't about mastering a single leadership style. It's about knowing when your default approach is no longer serving the institution. Early in our careers, structure feels like leadership. Mid-career, adaptability feels like survival. Later, interpretation and expression feel necessary to make sense of complexity. But wisdom comes from integration. The most effective leaders I've worked with don't abandon their strengths. They expand their range. They know when to slow down, step back, shift lenses, and ask different questions. They recognize when accreditation requires structure, responsiveness, meaning, or values-based clarity. Sometimes, even all at once. A question for the listener. So let me pause here and ask you, quietly and honestly, to reflect. When accreditation shows up at your institution, which leadership approach dominates? Which one is missing? Or what happens when pressure increases? And most importantly, what would it look like to lead accreditation differently, not permanently, but intentionally? What this season will explore. This season of Accreditation Unlocked is about leadership in practice. We'll look at how leadership approaches show up in meetings, planning processes, budget decisions, assessment systems, and institutional habits. We'll talk about how accreditation becomes a burden, a mirror, a stabilizing force, or a source of growth. Not because of standards, but because of leadership choices. Accreditation doesn't need better leaders. It needs more aware leaders. Leaders who recognize their default approach. Leaders who know when to shift. And leaders who understand that accreditation isn't a project to complete, but a practice to sustain. That is the work of leadership. And that's what we'll explore together this season. I'm Dr. Ken Clough from the Accreditation Collaborative. I'm so glad you're here, and thanks for listening. And everyone, keep on leading effectively.